Session 4 of Ecology as Theology, Inspiring Science for Challenging Times. The Prodigal Species Comes Home. So in this session, we'll look at what reality is telling us. Thus saith reality. What's inevitable? What's futile? And then what's pro-future? And why is it that compassion may be the most important pro-future feeling state to nurture? So, reminding us of our timeline, here we've got the 100-year timeline. At the beginning of the universe is 1 second after midnight of January 1st of the year 0, and right now is December 31st of the 99th year, right at midnight, just about to go into the 100th year. At that time scale, all of human history, Homo habilis until now, is the last week. And what we looked at here was this timeline in terms of if we survive, it will only be because we've come back home to reality, the prodigal species, religion 3.0. And what can we say confidently? Like, what is reality telling us through evidence that we can expect that's either inevitable or highly likely in the next minute on this cosmic century timeline? That is the next 250 years. Well, before we even go there, it's important to look at the next year, the big picture, because there will be a 101st year. There's going to be 140 million years from now. And climate will continue to change, the Milankovitch cycles, the Earth will wobble like a top, there'll be asteroids, there'll be supervolcanoes, there'll be extinctions, there'll be plate tectonics, which create supervolcanoes and tsunamis. All of this will continue long after we're gone. No mammalian species our size lasts more than 10 or 15 million years. So we're not going to be around 140 million years from now. But life will be. So from this perspective, one of the things that gives me hope is that we can embrace our species mortality when we shift from human-centeredness to life-centeredness. It allows us to embrace as right with the universe that everything is mortal, that everything is impermanent. And one of the things that gives me deep, deep hope and inspiration is that the worst case scenario, let's say we have a World War III and it becomes nuclear and we wipe ourselves out and we take many, many other species down with us and all of our nuclear power plants melt down. Worst case scenario, by early February of the 101st year, Earth will completely recovered. That's 12 million years from now. And that gives me hope because we're not going to see worst case scenario. We're just not. It's not going to be that bad no matter how stupid we are. And Connie, my wife, is not a gambling woman, but she says sometimes, half jokingly that even if we destroy ourselves, her money is on raccoons or the descendants of the raccoons to be the next self-reflexive intelligence. That is the next creature that comes to know that it knows, the next technological species, because they have the manual dexterity to create tools. And dolphins are really smart, but they can't create tools because they don't have the manual dexterity, nor can they domesticate fire. So it's likely to be the descendants of some land creature. And John Michael Greer, one of our favorite authors, he agrees with Connie. He thinks that raccoons, or the descendants of the raccoons, will be the next technological species. And he thinks that the third technological species, 100 million years from now, is likely to be the descendants of the corvids, the crows. And because in 100 million years, there's going to be a replenishment of petroleum, so they'll have the cheap, dense, concentrated energy. And because crows are already into flying, the great existential crisis, but also the great blessing to the crows, because it turns out that hubris is the main downfall of civilizations, and that's probably going to be true for other species as well, that the great blessing to the crows is that they're going to get to the moon. Because they've got the energy to do it, and they're into flying. And when they get to the moon, they're going to realize that some now extinct Earth species beat them to it. And maybe they don't have a favored relationship with whatever their name for primary reality is, and that will be the humbling that they need. So obviously, I share that with a sense of lightness because I've been introducing some really heavy stuff. But seriously, what can we expect that's inevitable or highly likely in the next minute, the next 250 years? So, inevitable or highly likely in the best case and medium case intergovernmental panel on climate change scenarios. That's the next 250 years, the next minute on the cosmic century timeline. There will be climate chaos. It's unavoidable. There'll be bigger storms, bigger droughts, longer droughts, more growing deserts and more deserts. There'll be growing wildfires and more intense wildfires, and profound shifts in where we can live and where we can grow food. This is now locked in. Sea level will continue to rise 25 to 40 feet, and that's even if every human being went extinct tonight. If some virus wiped us out and all humans went extinct tonight, the seas would continue to rise 25 to 40 feet in the next 250 years, and there's not a scientist that deals with the oceans that would debate what I'm now saying. We are in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction. We're causing it because of human-centeredness. The end of the fossil fuel era. This, for 99% of previous history, it was human and animal muscle power, and then firewood was our primary source of energy. And that's going to be the case into the future. This chart goes back 8,000 years and goes forward 8,000 years. This carbon pulse, this brief window of dense concentrated energy. A toxic legacy. Many communities will not be able to afford, with sea level rise, will not be able to afford, because there'll be an economic contraction and collapse, that they won't be able to afford to move all their toxic stuff away from the oceans. And there will be a contamination of many ocean shorelines as a result. Chemical and nuclear waste, toxic legacy. Population will shrink to less than 1 billion due to drought, famine, war, and living in a post-antibiotic age. We are within 25 to 30 years of living in a post-antibiotic age where basic infections can kill us. See, the bacteria don't need to believe in evolution. They're just evolving, and they're out-evolving us rapidly. And we know that it's going to be less than 1 billion because that's the carrying capacity. Even human beings living in an indigenous way, it was less than 1 billion. Much less if we live at like what William Catton calls Homo colossus, where each one of us lives like 20 or 30 indigenous people. That's, maybe, 1/8 of 1 billion. But fortunately, that's not possible once we have no more fossil fuels. Infrastructure's deteriorating and the mass migration of people, plants, and animals. This is inevitable. We call it collapse, but it's really the deterioration of infrastructures. And what we see in Syria and Venezuela and other parts of the world now is just the beginning. Much of Mexico is expected to be like the Sahara Desert in the next 250 years. Where are those people going to go? They're going to go north. They're going to go south. The end of the American Empire and the long descent of industrial civilization. The American Empire probably has another 4 or 5 seconds on this time scale, another 20, 25 years. At most, where 5% of the world's population benefit from 25 to 30% of the world's resources. That's going to go bye-bye. All empires, collapse at some point, usually about 250 years. And the long descent of industrial civilization. We talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. It wasn't a cliff. It was a stair step. The death of techno-idolatry, the anti-future secular religion of everlasting growth and human-centered progress on a finite planet. Here's where we start to get the good news. Salvage and ecotechnic societies where globalization, permaculture becomes globalized. Agroecology becomes globalized. Relocalization, in other words, it's the opposite of what we now think about in terms of globalization. All roads lead local is the way Richard Heinberg speaks about it. This is long after we have the energy, where we no longer have the energy to mine metals and materials, we have tons of metals and materials in our cities that can be repurposed. And millions of people will live meaningful and joyful lives, die peacefully, and leave a sweet legacy. We see this throughout the collapse of previous civilizations. We do see 20% of the worst of humanity show up, no question. But we also typically see 80% of the best of humanity that shows up. And think about it just from the perspective of young men. There are tens of millions of young men throughout the world, maybe hundreds of millions, all over the world that are profoundly addicted to internet gaming, internet porn, or both. And that will not be the case when their communities need them again. It'll be the salvation of an entire generation of young men. They won't be wasting their times in front of a screen when their communities need them. And one of the sad things, but it's also real, is that the vast majority of people will deny most of the above right up until the very end. And that doesn't mean the end of time. It means the end of their life. Turns out in virtually every previous civilization for which we have evidence, most people remain in denial right up to the end. They never accept reality. William Ophuls is one of our intellectual mentors. He's one of the main voices in bringing a profoundly ecological worldview into politics, into polity. And I love this quote. He says, "Sustainability, as usually understood, is an oxymoron. Industrial man has used the found wealth of the New World and the stocks of fossil hydrocarbons to create an anti-ecological Titanic. making the deck chairs recyclable, painting them red or blue, feeding the boilers with biofuels, and every other effort to transform or green the Titanic will ultimately fail. In the end, the ship is doomed by the laws of thermodynamics and by implacable biological and geological limits that are already beginning to bite. We shall soon be obliged to trade in the Titanic for a schooner. In other words, a post-industrial future that, however technologically sophisticated, resembles the pre-industrial past in many important respects. It turns out that ecological overshoot is always a religious failure. It's fundamentally a religious failure. Because human-centeredness, when your God is not synonymous with reality, human-centeredness becomes the norm, and then you start focusing on all these other problems and all these other issues. It's like the elephant and the blind men, focusing on different aspects of the elephant, you miss the entire being. Turns out that all of these major important things that we focus on as activists, which are really worthy of our focusing, both human-centered and ecological, these are profoundly important things. But all of these are symptoms. None of these are the cause. All of these are symptoms of ecological overshoot. And that itself is caused by human-centeredness, human-centered hubris, idolatry, both of the religious kind and of the secular kind. Again, religious idolatry is when your God is not synonymous with reality. It's having a trivial, limited, finite, unreal, and otherworldly God. But it's also having secular ultimate commitments or ultimate concerns. If your secular God, that is progress or technology or the market, so you've got religious and secular forms of idolatry. I mentioned The Long Descent before. John Michael Greer, one of the top 10 books I've ever read in my life is John Michael Greer's The Long Descent. And he catalogs how it is that all of these previous civilizations have gone through the process of what he calls catabolic collapse. That is, we overextend what we can afford to maintain, and then the society starts feeding on itself, eating itself. And this is the way that virtually every previous civilization has collapsed. The only exceptions are those that collapse because of like a volcano or something. And one of the most famous books in this field, Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies, he talks about the fact that what happens is we use complexity to solve problems caused by complexity. But then there becomes a point where it's negative marginal returns. In other words, the more complexity we add, the worse it makes. It doesn't make things better. And then societies contract. And they typically don't contract in a perfect bell-shaped curve. They contract more like this. As Seneca said, the path of increase is slow, but the path to ruin is swift. And Ugo Bardi wrote a book on the Seneca Cliff. This is a vitally important distinction, the distinction between problems, which can be potentially solved, and predicaments, which can't be solved. They have to be adapted to, lived with, dealt with. Death, for example, is not a problem that can be solved. It's a predicament that we have to live with and ultimately die with. See, we're used to thinking in the 20th century, so many of our issues were problems that if we just threw enough energy and enough human ingenuity at something, we could solve many problems. But many of those problems have now morphed into predicaments that can't be solved. They have to be adapted to. And nobody has furthered this more powerfully than William Catton in his masterful book Overshoot, which, as I've mentioned before, is one of the most important books that's ever been written. Connie and I both consider it the most important book we've ever read in our lives. In fact, I recorded an unofficial audio of the book where I allow myself to be moved to tears, and you can hear it. It's up on my Grace Limits page. If you just put Grace Limits audios in Google or sustainability audios, you'll find my reading of that. But the unfathomed predicament of humankind, he says, is basically that the Europeans had achieved saturation level. That is, Europeans had reached population pressure. They had abused the natural world. They had overshot the carrying capacity, and the soil was washing away. The forests were being destroyed. There was all kinds of conflict. And then an entire new hemisphere was discovered from the European perspective. Of course, it was fully inhabited by indigenous Americans who were living more sustainably as a general rule. But from the European perspective, it was uninhabited because our diseases, the European diseases, went ahead of most of us and wiped out 90% of the Native Americans, sometimes by actually passing on diseased blankets. So there was evil involved there too. But the point is that from the European perspective, there was more than enough of every kind of resource you can imagine. More than enough timber, fish, animals of all kinds, coal, oil, natural gas. And so there was this sense of limitlessness. There was this exuberance of spirit. And so all of the institutions and the mindset that was forged in America reflected this sense of limitlessness. And then we shipped that mindset and those institutions all over the world. So now the people in India and China expect to eventually be able to live like middle-class Americans. And yet we would need 5 to 7 planets of resources for that to be the case. It's not possible. So the unfathomed predicament of humankind is that the discovery of the New World and the discovery of fossil fuels led Americans, and now all the nations of the world, to have carrying capacity surplus expectations and institutions. But our predicament is that we actually live now in a carrying capacity deficit world. And many people mistakenly believe that technology is going to save our butts. And it turns out, no, that's not the case. Most of our problems are caused by human-centered technologies. Technology will not save us or the environment. This book is considered one of the Bibles in this whole movement, this whole understanding of why it is that technology will not be our savior, that that's another form of idol. Technofix shows that negative, unintended consequences of technology are inherently predictable and unavoidable, that techno-optimism is completely unjustified, and that modern technology, in the presence of continued economic growth, does not promote sustainability but hastens collapse. The authors convincingly demonstrate that most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are counterproductive. They explore the reasons for the uncritical acceptance of new technologies, show who really controls the direction of technological change, and then advocate extensive reform. And back a few years ago, there was a major conference in New York on exactly this topic, techno-utopianism and the fate of the earth. Why technology will not save us or the world. It was like a who's who of leaders, of thinkers, of activists, of writers in this field. So what is reality telling us is inevitable? And now what is reality telling us is futile? Because we want to accept what's inevitable. That's what we just took a look at. So what's futile? We don't want to invest time and energy in what's actually futile. Well, hoping for perpetual progress, imminent apocalypse, or if we all just, turns out those are the three most common beliefs, and they're never true. Things never continue getting better. It's never the end of the world, nor does everybody all come together to believe in something, to make the right choice. Never happened yet. But it's also futile to expect your loved ones to not hope or believe in one of these three delusions. So compassion is the order of the day. Assuming that technology or the market can sustain what is unsustainable. Not going to happen. Faith in the techno-narcissistic religion, the secular religion of everlasting growth on a finite planet. It's futile. Expecting your instincts to not at least occasionally challenge you and others. In the next session, I talk about how our instincts, our mismatched instincts, are a main source of why we get addicted, why we struggle, why we fall, why our kids and grandkids have problems. It's not because our great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple. It's because we have mismatched instincts and we live in a world of supernormal stimuli. The next session after that is about mortality and death, a sacred science approach to mortality and death and impermanence. Because denying that mortality and death are real and necessary, individually and collectively, is futile. Expecting religion or society to repent of human-centeredness prior to collapse, it's not going to happen. Expecting industrial civilization and global capitalism to run on renewable energy. There may be a way of having an ecological civilization that runs on renewable energy, but we can't run this kind of civilization on renewable energy. And it's also futile to mistake the end of the world as we know it for the end of the world, full stop. See, sanity and insanity are not just personal, individual things. There's such a thing as collective sanity and collective insanity. That is where our thinking collectively is either aligned with reality or not aligned with reality. This image, in my opinion, is an image of collective insanity. This was taken in Oregon in 2017, summer of 2017. I love this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson. Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. See, that's the great reckoning. And it's not because some supernatural, otherworldly deity is pissed off at us and punishing us. It's because there's consequences when we live out of right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. But I believe this can also be the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species, after squandering our inheritance, coming home to God, coming home to reality. I think especially deserving of compassion and generosity, and nothing may be more important for being pro-future, Christian. Again, Christian not as beliefs, but as being a savior of the future, a redeemer of humanity, than nurturing compassion and generosity. And I think especially deserving of compassion and generosity are poor people, communities, and nations who will suffer the most from climate and ecological breakdowns, yet who contributed the least to its main causes. Those of us feeling the loneliness of having to navigate our own downshifting expectations, whilst family, friends, and maybe even spouses are still in denial. Individuals, couples, children, families, and communities of our fellow social and mammalian species who generally feel and suffer just like we do. Techno-optimists and free market fundamentalists who will remain in denial the longest and be hardest hit emotionally and financially when reality bites. Religious, political, and social liberals and progressives whose faith in the religion of perpetual progress is currently being shaken, shattered, or abandoned. And religious conservatives and evangelicals whose faith in the Bible has blinded them to what God, reality, has revealed through facts about our inner, outer, social, and mortal nature, and who thus struggle disproportionately with addiction, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, depression, suicide, and sin in general. It turns out that compassion for ourselves and others really is the fundamental virtue to nurture, to be pro-future. So again, this is a beta version. I welcome any and all suggestions for improvement. This is my contact information and websites.